For about 20 years, you have been promised a cyber war, a digital Pearl Harbor, planes falling out of the sky, water treatment plants poisoned, a country switched off in an afternoon by somebody in a hoodie. It did not happen like that. But something did happen in one country for a decade, and almost nobody outside the industry can tell you what it actually looked like. Start here, December 2015, Western Ukraine. It is dark by mid-afternoon, and it is well below freezing. In a regional electricity control room, an operator is at his desk when his mouse pointer starts moving across the screen without him. He grabs the mouse. Nothing. The pointer travels to a breaker on the diagram of the grid, opens it, and moves on to the next one. He watches his own cursor switch off a town. Then he is logged out of his own machine, and the password will not work because it is not his password anymore. Around 230,000 people lost power that day. It is the first blackout in history that investigators confirmed was caused by a cyber attack. And it is the beginning, not the climax. What follows is the only sustained cyber war anybody has been able to study properly, and the honest conclusion is not the one either side of the argument wanted. It starts with a grid, 3 utilities, and a very ordinary email. 23rd of December 2015, 3 Ukrainian regional electricity distribution companies are hit at essentially the same time. The intrusion was not sudden. Investigators later established that the attackers had been inside those corporate networks for months, patient, quiet, reading. They had arrived through spear phishing, a document attached to an email that looked like it belonged to somebody's job. That is how they got in. It is nearly always how they get in. And I want you to notice how unglamorous it is, because that is a theme tonight. Once inside the office network, they did the slow work, harvesting credentials, learning the layout, finding the bridge from the ordinary corporate network into the industrial control systems that actually operate the grid. In a properly built utility, those two worlds are supposed to be separated. In practice, there is nearly always a door between them because engineers need to work from their desks. Then, on the day, they did several things at once, and the combination is what makes this an operation rather than a hack. They opened the breakers remotely, using the utility's own control software in the utility's own way. Nothing exotic. They had simply become operators. They overrode the firmware on the serial to Ethernet converters, the small dumb boxes that let the control room talk to substations. Once those were bricked, even after the intruders were gone, the operators could not send commands down the line. They had to get in vehicles and drive to substations to close breakers by hand, in the dark, in December. They wiped operator workstations to slow the recovery and destroy the record, and they attacked the call center with a flood of automated calls so that customers ringing to report an outage could not get through, and the utility lost its fastest source of information about what was failing and where. That last one is the detail I would keep. Somebody sat in a planning meeting and thought about the telephones. This was not an act of vandalism executed by people who enjoy breaking things. It was a plan with a communications component, built by people who understood that a utility in a crisis runs on knowing what is happening. Power was restored within hours, and it was restored because Ukrainian grid operators could still run their system manually. Their substations had not been fully automated. Older, more manual infrastructure turned out to be a form of resilience, which is a genuinely uncomfortable finding for every modernized grid in the world. I want to stay in that control room for one more minute though, because there is something in it that the technical write-ups do not capture. Put yourself at that desk. Your entire professional life is built on the assumption that the machine in front of you does what you tell it. That is not a belief you hold consciously. It is the floor you stand on. And then, on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon in December, the pointer starts moving, and the floor is gone. You cannot stop it. You cannot log back in. The system is doing real things to a real grid, in real towns, and you are watching it happen from the chair you have sat in for years as a spectator. The operators in 2015 did the right thing, which was to give up on the screen and get in the car. But the psychological content of that event, the specific horror of watching your own tools operated by somebody else, is a large part of why this attack changed the field. Every person who works in industrial control heard that story and understood immediately that it could be their room. There is one more thing worth knowing about the timing. It was 3 days before Christmas, in the coldest part of the year, in a country already at war in its east since 2014. None of that is a technical decision. All of it is a decision about people. 2 notes on scope before we go further, and then I will not interrupt again. First, there is nothing in this episode that teaches anybody how to do any of this. I will tell you what happened and what it means. The technical detail stops where usefulness to an attacker begins. Second, and more important, I'm not going to name a single individual, and every attribution you hear tonight will be given to you as the published finding of a named organization, a court indictment, a government statement, a named security research team. I will tell you who concluded what and on what basis and where the confidence is high or low. Russia has consistently denied responsibility for the operations described in this episode, and that denial is part of the record too. This program does not accuse people. It reports what has been formally alleged, by whom, and how strong the evidence looks. December 2016. Almost exactly a year later. Kyiv, a transmission substation north of the city. The lights go out again for about an hour. Smaller in effect, vastly more significant in method. Because in 2015, human beings had sat at keyboards and driven the grid manually, like remote operators. In 2016, the researchers who examined the malware found something else, software that spoke the grid's own languages by itself. The tool was named Industroyer by the researchers at ESET, who analyzed it, and it was built with modules for the industrial protocols that electricity substations use to talk to each other. It did not need to understand what a substation is. It needed to speak the protocol, and it did, natively. Understand the difference, and you understand why this one frightened people who work in this field. A human attacker driving a control system does not scale. One operator, one grid, in real time, learning as they go. A program that speaks the protocol is a capability you can copy. It can be pointed at another target. It can be handed to somebody else. It turns a bespoke operation into a weapon with a manual. Analysts also found that the tool included a timed component and a wiper, so that after it acted, it would destroy the systems around it. Not just because an outage, make the recovery slow and the forensics hard. And here's the part that lands differently once you know what came later. Reviewing the 2016 event afterwards, researchers concluded that the damage it caused was well below what the tool was capable of, which supports a reading that a lot of people in this field hold about the whole decade. Several of these operations look less like attempts to inflict maximum harm and more like tests. A demonstration of a capability conducted on a real country? June 2017. This is the one that reached you, even if you had never heard its name. It began in Ukrainian accounting software, not a glamorous target, a tax and accounting package widely used by companies operating in Ukraine. The attackers compromised its update mechanism, which meant the malware arrived on machines the way legitimate software arrives. Through the update, everybody is told to install. What came down that pipe presented itself as ransomware. It locked machines and demanded payment. That was a costume. Analysts established quickly that the mechanism for actually recovering files was broken by design. There was no way to pay and get your data back, because getting your data back was never on offer. It was a wiper wearing a ransom note. It spread inside networks with extraordinary efficiency, and it did not stop at the Ukrainian border. It could not. A worm does not know what a border is, it knows what a network is. So it moved out through the corporate networks of any company that had a Ukrainian office, a Ukrainian subsidiary, a Ukrainian supplier, and in 2017, that was a very long list of the world's large companies. A global shipping firm, a pharmaceutical giant, a logistics company, a food manufacturer. Terminals stopped. Production lines stopped. In some cases, entire corporate networks had to be rebuilt from nothing. The United States government and the United Kingdom's National Cybersecurity Center both publicly attributed the attack to the Russian military in February 2018. Russia denied it. The total damage is usually put in the billions of dollars, and the American indictment that came later identified nearly $1 billion in losses to just 3 named victims. Here's why this is the most important event in the episode, and it has nothing to do with the size of the number. Whoever built this did not choose those global victims. The global victims were collateral. The operation appears to have been aimed at Ukraine through a piece of Ukrainian software, and the rest of the world was hit because the rest of the world was connected to Ukraine by ordinary commerce. Everybody who thought about cyber conflict before 2017 assumed you could aim it. That a state could hit a target in another country the way you would hit a bridge, precisely, with a known blast radius. Notpetya is the proof that you cannot. Not reliably. Once a self-spreading tool is released into networks that are joined to each other by ordinary business, the notion of a target becomes approximate. And the way it spread deserves one more sentence because it is the reason so many well-defended companies fell over. It did not need anybody to click anything twice. Once it was on one machine inside an organization, it used the ordinary mechanisms of a corporate Windows network, the same administrative tools that let a support team manage 10,000 computers from one desk, to move sideways, quickly, everywhere. Think about what that means. The features that made those networks manageable were the features that made them fatal. There is no patch for that because it is not a flaw, it is the design. There is also a legal aftershock that tells you how badly our categories fit this. Companies that lost hundreds of millions turned to their insurers, and some insurers refused to pay, citing the standard exclusion for acts of war. The argument that followed ran for years in the courts. Is malware released by a state that hits a company doing business in a third country an act of war for the purposes of a commercial policy? That question had never needed an answer before. And notice that it only became urgent because governments had publicly attributed the attack to a state. Attribution is not only a diplomatic act, it moves money. Finally, the human scale of the cleanup. At one of the affected multinationals, the recovery is reported to have involved rebuilding essentially the entire global network, thousands of servers, tens of thousands of computers, from scratch in a matter of days, by people who had no email, no phone directory, and no working file share with which to organize the work. That is what a modern cyber incident actually looks like from the inside. Not a dramatic countdown on a screen. Thousands of exhausted people rebuilding an organization by hand. October 2020. A federal grand jury in Pittsburgh returns an indictment against 6 officers of Unit 74455 of the Russian Military Intelligence Service, the GRU, the group security researchers have been calling Sandworm. I need to be precise about what an indictment is, because this is exactly the place where a documentary can quietly mislead you. An indictment is an accusation. It is a prosecutor's statement of what they believe they can prove. None of the 6 has been tried, none has been convicted, and none is in custody. They are, in the language that matters, accused. What makes this document remarkable is not the charges, it is the scope. In one filing, American prosecutors tied together the 2015 and 2016 Ukrainian blackouts, notpetya, and the disruption of the 2018 Winter Olympics in South Korea, and alleged that they were the work of the same unit, of the same military. And you should ask the obvious question, what is the point? Nobody expected these 6 people to be arrested. Russia does not extradite its own officers. The point is the record. Before the indictment, the link between the blackouts and notpetya was a matter of technical inference by private companies. Malware similarities. Shared infrastructure. Reasonable, but contestable. After the indictment, a sovereign state had put its name on the claim in a court filing, with the evidentiary standard that implies, and had made it very hard for anybody to keep saying that nobody really knows who does this. That is what attribution is for in the modern era, not arrests, names in a document that other governments, insurers, courts, and journalists can then rely on. And it is worth understanding how that document gets built, because the popular picture is wrong. Attribution is not one clever analyst spotting a signature. It is the accumulation of dull, overlapping evidence. Malware that reuses code from earlier operations, servers rented from the same providers with the same habits, activity that clusters into a working day in a particular time zone and stops on particular public holidays, mistakes in operational security repeated across years. No single one of those proves anything. Any one of them can be faked. What is hard to fake is all of them, consistently, over a decade, while conducting operations under time pressure. That is why researchers speak in terms of confidence rather than certainty, and it is why you should be suspicious of anyone in this field who does not. The honest position, most of the time, is high confidence with named reasoning, not proof. I would also note what the indictment did not claim, because restraint is evidence of care. It did not attribute every attack in Ukraine to this unit. It did not say cyber operations caused the war or won anything. It laid out a set of specific incidents with specific technical links and stopped. January 2022. Weeks before the full-scale invasion, Ukrainian government websites are defaced, and researchers at Microsoft identify destructive malware on Ukrainian systems, given the name Whispergate, again disguised as ransomware. Again, with no genuine recovery path. 23rd of February, 2022. The evening before the invasion begins. Researchers at ESET and at Symantec detect a new wiper on hundreds of machines across multiple Ukrainian organizations, and it is given the name Hermetic Wiper. Hours before troops cross the border. And then, on the morning of the 24th of February itself, comes the operation that best answers the question this episode is really about. The target was a satellite network, KASAT, operated by the American company Viasat, providing broadband across Europe and used, among many other customers, by Ukrainian military and government users. Tens of thousands of modems across Europe were disabled by malicious software pushed down to them, a wiper that researchers named Acid Rain. The modems did not merely disconnect, they stopped working and had to be replaced. In May 2022, the European Union, the United Kingdom, the United States, and a long list of other governments issued coordinated statements attributing that attack to the Russian state. It is one of the largest formal, multinational attributions of a cyber attack ever made. Russia denied responsibility. Now hold the timing in your head, because this is the single clearest thing in 10 years of evidence. The satellite attack happened in the same hour as the invasion, not instead of it, not months before it, as a substitute for it. In the same hour, against a communication system the defending military was using, at the exact moment when losing communications matters most. That is what cyber operations turned out to be, not an alternative to war, a supporting arm of one, like artillery preparation, or jamming, or cutting a telephone line before an assault. It is used to make the physical operation work. And there was spillover again, because there is always spillover. Thousands of wind turbines in Germany lost their remote monitoring connections that same morning because they happened to use the same satellite service. Nobody targeted German wind turbines. They were simply on the network. Now let me tell you what did not happen in the weeks that followed, because the absence is the most interesting finding of the whole war. In the early spring of 2022, a great many serious people expected a cyber campaign that would take Ukraine off the internet, empty its banks, and darken its cities in support of the advance. That was the mainstream expectation. It is what a decade of analysis had predicted. It did not arrive. There were a great many attacks. Wipers, intrusions, defacements, attempts on the energy sector, and Ukraine stayed online, the banking system kept working, and mobile networks kept running. Several things explain that, and none of them is magic. Ukrainian networks had spent 7 years being attacked and had learned. Ukrainian institutions had moved critical systems into cloud infrastructure outside the country, so that servers could not be destroyed by artillery or seized on the ground. Foreign technology companies and foreign government teams supplied help at a scale that had never been attempted before. And when terrestrial connectivity was destroyed physically, satellite terminals were shipped in to replace it. There is a lesson in there that has nothing to do with computers. The reason the digital attack underperformed is that the defenders had a decade of practice, deep foreign support, and somewhere else to put their data. Take away any one of those three, and the story reads differently. April 2022. And this one matters more than any of the successful attacks, which is why almost nobody outside the field knows it happened. Ukraine's Computer Emergency Response Team, CERT-UA, working with researchers from ESET and with Microsoft, disclosed that they had disrupted an operation in progress against a Ukrainian regional energy provider serving around 2 million people. The tooling included a new version of the grid malware from 2016, Industroyer 2, compiled specifically for the substation in question, with the target's own configuration written into it. Alongside its SAT wipers, prepared to destroy the operator workstations immediately afterwards so that recovery would be slow and reconstruction difficult. The attackers had been inside the network for weeks. The execution was scheduled, and it was found and pulled apart before it ran. No customer lost power. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the most underreported result of this entire decade. The same capability that succeeded in 2015 and again in 2016 was detected and stopped in 2022 in the middle of an invasion in a country under bombardment. That happened because of 7 years of unglamorous work. Monitoring, incident response, threat intelligence sharing with foreign companies, the government computer emergency team becoming genuinely capable, and a great deal of help from international partners. Defense, it turns out, is not hopeless. It is expensive, it is slow, it produces no headline when it works, and it works. December 2023. Kyivstar, Ukraine's largest mobile operator with more than 20 million subscribers, goes down. Mobile service. Internet. In some regions, the air raid alert systems that depend on it. The head of the cybersecurity department of Ukraine's security service, the SBU, later described the attack publicly and stated that the intruders had been inside the network for months before acting, and that when they acted, they destroyed thousands of virtual servers and computers. He attributed the operation to the same Russian military unit discussed earlier in this episode. Note the target: not a power station, not a weapons factory, a phone company. By 2023, the pattern has moved on from the grid, and the reason is instructive. Electricity in Ukraine was, by then, being attacked with missiles. There is no point developing a delicate multi-month intrusion to switch off a substation that can be destroyed from the air. What a missile cannot do is reach inside a mobile network and delete it, and take with it the ability to call your family, receive an air raid warning, or run a business. So the cyber effort moved to where it still had an advantage. That is not escalation. It is substitution. And it tells you something honest about the whole domain. Cyber operations get used where they are cheaper or more available than a physical strike, and they get dropped the moment a physical strike is easier. The second half of that story is worth as much as the attack itself. Kyivstar service was substantially restored within days, not because anybody paid anybody, and not because the attack was mild. By the SBU's own public account, it was severe, and a great deal of infrastructure was destroyed outright. It came back because a large modern telecommunications company can, if it has to, rebuild core systems from backups and replacement hardware while the country watches. Two things kept the damage from being worse, and both are unglamorous. Competing operators opened their networks so that customers of a rival could get signal, which is the sort of thing that requires a decision by a regulator and executives in a room, not a technology. And the intrusion, though it had reportedly lasted months, did not reach everything, because not everything was joined to everything else. That is the same finding as 2015, arriving from a different direction. In 2015, the saving grace was that the grid could be run by hand. In 2023, it was that the country had more than one phone network and that they were willing to carry each other. Redundancy is not efficient. Two networks cost more than one, and a manual procedure that is used twice a decade looks like waste on any spreadsheet you care to build. The entire decade we have just walked through is an argument for keeping the waste. Let me pull the decade together, because the honest summary annoys nearly everybody. Cyber operations did not win a war, and they did not lose one. Nobody was switched off. No country collapsed. The apocalyptic prediction that a nation could be defeated from a keyboard has now been tested for 10 years in the most intensely targeted country on Earth, and it did not happen. But the opposite claim is just as wrong, and it is fashionable in some circles that cyber is overhyped, that none of it really matters, that it is all defacements and inconvenience. Tell that to a company that rebuilt its entire global network after notpetya. Tell it to somebody who lost heating in December, or to a person who could not receive an air raid alert. What it actually is, on the evidence, is four things. It is a supporting arm. It arrives with, or just before, physical force, and its job is to degrade what the defender relies on: communications, coordination, information. It is unreliable in a very specific way. Effects leak. Ukrainian accounting software takes down a Danish shipping company. A satellite attack takes out German wind turbines. This is the domain's defining property, and there is no sign anybody has solved it. It is attritional rather than decisive. Its value is grinding over years, not a single knockout. And a defender who invests can absorb it, which is the 2022 lesson. And it is deniable, which is the whole point. Every operation in this episode has been formally attributed by governments and denied by the accused state. And that gap, the space between everybody knowing and nobody being able to compel anything, is not a bug in the strategy. It is the strategy. There is a fifth observation, and it is the one I would argue about with anybody in this field. 10 years of this produced no rules. There is no treaty governing what may be attacked, no agreed definition of what counts as an armed attack in this domain, and therefore no clear line for when a country is entitled to respond with force. The cleanup after NotPetya was litigated by insurance lawyers rather than settled by international law, which should tell you where the actual authority currently sits. Compare that with almost any other military capability. Chemical weapons, landmines, the treatment of prisoners, all of them acquired conventions, imperfect and frequently broken, but written down. Cyber operations have been used in a major European war for years, and the world's response has been statements. I am not going to pretend to know how that gets solved, but you should know that it has not been, because a great deal of comforting commentary in this field assumes rules that do not exist. 4 things you can use, and none of them require you to work in security. 1. Your risk is not your own security, it is your supplier's security. NotPetya reached global corporations through a Ukrainian tax package, and the Viazat attack reached German wind farms through a satellite contract. Whatever you run, a company, a team, a household, the honest question is not how strong your defenses are. It is what would happen to you if a supplier you depend on stopped existing tomorrow morning. 2. A manual fallback is a real defense. Ukrainian engineers restored power in 2015 by driving to substations and closing breakers by hand, because that was still possible. Every process you have made fully automatic is a process you can no longer perform when the automation is the thing that has been attacked. Knowing how to run the manual version is not nostalgia, it is capacity. 3. Attribution is a claim with an author, and you should always ask who is making it. When you hear that a country did something, the useful questions are, who says so, and what kind of document, and what would they have had to know? A criminal indictment, a coordinated government statement, and an anonymously sourced news report are 3 completely different weights of evidence, and the difference between them is most of what separates analysis from noise. 4. Defense works, and it is boring. The single best outcome in this decade was April 2022, where nothing happened, and nothing happened because of years of monitoring and drills and information sharing that no one ever got a headline for. That is the actual shape of security. If your defenses ever look like a waste of money, that may be because they are working. The story that closes the decade is not the blackout. It is the blackout that was scheduled and was found and did not occur. And if you take nothing else from tonight, take the correction at the center of it. The thing you were warned about. A country switched off from a keyboard. A war won without soldiers has now been attempted by a capable state against a real target for 10 years with no restraint worth speaking of. It did not work. What did work was smaller and nastier. Erasing a company's records, taking the phones away from a city, breaking the tools people use to organize themselves, and doing it repeatedly until the cost accumulates. That is not the apocalypse anybody sold tickets to. It is worse in one particular way though, and I will leave you with it. An apocalypse would be over. This is a permanent condition, and everybody reading a screen tonight is already living inside it. Next Saturday on Cyber Wars, we go back to the moment this entire field went public. January 2010. Google does something no large company had ever done. It announces publicly that it has been broken into by a state, names the country it suspects, and threatens to leave that country's market over it. The operation is remembered as Aurora, and more than 30 other major companies turn out to have been hit in the same campaign. Before Aurora, corporate breaches were handled quietly by lawyers. After Aurora, they were front page news. That is EP3. If you want the rest of this series as it is built, follow the channel. 1 episode every Saturday.